and welcome to the 905 podcast. My name is Roland Tanner,
I am Joel McLeod.
and we've got something a little bit different today. As some of you will have noticed, I was away for a few weeks, and before we went away, Joel and I kind of thought about, what could we do to kind of use that experience, I guess, and we thought, I could do a little bit of research into an episode of a kind of a compare and contrast things, urban things, transit things in Scotland, which is where I was with the 905. So what we're going to start off with today is a kind of short essay about that experience, and then we're going to come back and discuss some of it and ask some questions about what it maybe tells us, what it can usefully illuminate about similar things that are happening in the 905 region right now. So listen up, and we'll be back afterwards.
Hello.
Hi.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. There you are.
Thanks very much.
Thanks now. Hello there.
What you're listening to is the sound of Scotland on a freezing cold January day a few weeks ago. Freezing cold compared to January in Canada, I hear you say? Don't be ridiculous. But all I can reply is that for most of the 3 weeks I spent in Scotland, I felt chilled to the bone in a way I hardly ever do in Canada. And more specifically though, it's the sound of Edinburgh's Tram. Some of you may have noticed that I was away for a few weeks. January tends to be a month when I take a business trip back to the UK, specifically Scotland, to attend a conference that's important for my day job in academic publishing. It's also an opportunity to see family and friends and to revisit a few past haunts from before I emigrated to Canada. Although I grew up in the south of England, just west of London, from 1993 to 2003 I lived in Scotland, and it's to Scotland that I owe the basis of my professional existence, podcast notwithstanding. Through a combination of childhood obsession and summer vacations, I ended up spending about 10 years studying and working at St Andrews University, at the far and chilliest end of what's known as the East Nook of the Kingdom of Fife. Fife, it should be noted, has not been a kingdom for well over 1,000 years, but old habits die hard in that part of the world. During my decade living in Scotland, I lived in various towns and villages in Fife, and also for a while in an ornately Gothic gatehouse outside a stately home just on the outskirts of Edinburgh. To say the least, both rural and urban Scotland are just a little bit different from Ontario's 905 region. So why am I inflicting an account of my winter travels on listeners to this podcast? Well, because many of the challenges we face today in the 905 are challenges also faced in other parts of the world. We tend to be, and when I say we mean all countries around the world, tend to be extraordinarily bad at looking at how other places have dealt with issues and using those experiences to make better decisions ourselves. One obvious example is the tale, some would say saga or tragedy, of Edinburgh's new tram network. Edinburgh's tram is in fact a light rail transit or LRT system of exactly the kind envisaged for various parts of the 905 region, most notably Hamilton, and already completed in Waterloo. Work on Edinburgh's new tram network began in 2007 with the financial support from the then Labour Party-led Scottish Government. Much like LRTs in Ontario, it was controversial from the start, with numerous efforts to outright cancel the project. In the end, it was scaled back significantly after a change in government, with the initial plan for 3 routes slowly being reduced down to just one, running from Edinburgh Airport in the west into the city centre. Even so, somewhat predictably, the estimated costs for construction had already begun to escalate, reaching over £500 million, or about 900,000 Canadian dollars, by 2008. But that was just the beginning. Contractual disputes, delays due to construction difficulties building in a World Heritage City, as well as opposition from various groups including cyclists, led to what seemed like perennial delays and cost overruns. Meanwhile, the main western approach into Edinburgh for cars and buses was a continual nightmare of diversions and construction blockages for years on end. But despite everything, including public and political opposition, funding crises, and eventually a full statutory public inquiry into the cause of the delays and cost overruns that is still running today, Edinburgh's Tram, or the first phase of it, was finished and opened in 2014. So what of it today? As a one-time, albeit infrequent user of Edinburgh's buses, the Tram just seems much, much better. A one-way ticket from end to end, a journey of about half an hour, will cost you a bit over $2, which seems pretty reasonable. Although be warned, if you go the extra half mile to Edinburgh Airport, the fee suddenly jumps to about $8. But there's hardly any waiting, with trams leaving about every 15 minutes, and the journey into the city gives you fantastic views of one of Europe's most beautiful streetscapes. And of course, Edinburgh's tram isn't really a tram, a streetcar in the early 20th century sense of the word at all. The carriages are spacious and comfortable. Before COVID hit, Edinburgh's tram had even started to make profits in 2017, 2 years ahead of schedule. In the same year, a survey found that tram users had a 99% customer satisfaction rating. It's difficult to imagine that any form of public transit ever getting a mark that high, so it seemed that, as far as the actual users were concerned anyway, Edinburgh's trams were a success. With the second stage of tram construction now going ahead, there is more inconvenience for drivers, and the busy road from the east end of Princes Street down to the Leith Docks has been a mess of construction now for a couple of years. I can confirm from personal experience that you don't want to get stuck in the centre of Edinburgh at rush hour at the moment. It took me about 20 minutes just to turn around a corner on the way out of a parking lot. But it's difficult to deny that once an LRT is available, even at the high cost in dollars and inconvenience of construction, the benefits it brings to any city is going to outweigh that short-term pain of construction. For a city like Edinburgh, which was already an economic powerhouse, ironically, the benefits for the city may actually be less obvious than they will be for a city like Hamilton. Edinburgh never had any huge vacant lots in its downtown, but Edinburgh did need to relieve narrow downtown streets that were designed for horses, not SUVs, and to reduce the amount of air pollution. So if you live in a 905 city that has plans for an LRT, get ready for a process that may be difficult. And let's face it, Hamilton's path to an LRT has already had more than its fair share of adventures. But once it's there, it has the potential to fundamentally change the city for the better.
Next stop, Haymarket. Change here for onward rail connections.
Welcome back. Joel,
Yes.
what do you reckon of my what I did on my winter vacation essay?
Well, first of all, why did you go to Scotland in the winter time? Normally in the winter time we go to places like Barbados or the Cayman Islands, someplace fun like that. So I think you went in the wrong direction, but I understand work and what have you. But I find it interesting because I mean, years ago I went to Scotland when I was a wee lad, so I kind of understand the mentality or the vision that you're portraying there. What I find interesting is that the fact that you can, in a city like Edinburgh, which is literally thousands of years old, they can find a way to incorporate modern conveniences like an LRT. Right, you picture like this. I think when most of us over here in the new world, if you will, go back to visit in our mind are thinking of Edinburgh, we're thinking of like a medieval city, tight streets, barely walk, not walkable, but just like you can barely fit yourself across. They're just such tight streets built before the idea of the automobile, and yet they're still able to do these things like an LRT for the population.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. And it's I'll fully admit to being a bit of an Edinburgh file, Edinburgh junkie, whatever. I just think it's one of the best cities in the world, even in winter when it is very cold. I mean, not as cold as Canada, but somehow still colder. I don't know how that's explained, but temperature does different things in Scotland at this time of year. I think it's a fantastic city. It's a densely populated city. It's got so many good things about it. And it's a city that has kept and treasured its past at every stage. So you've got buildings literally dating from the early 1500s, besides buildings from the 17 and 1800s, beside buildings from the 2020s, uh, all kind of cheek by jowl and somehow managing to work together. And you know, this whole story of light rail, of Edinburgh's light rail or its tram, it is a saga. And you know, you ask anybody about it, and I spoke to quite a few people about it, and they're like, oh my god, you know, it was a nightmare. They were just digging up the roads for years on end. They're still digging up the roads, because now they're doing the second phase, which is in many ways more difficult than the first phase, because the first phase actually, by and large, does not use the streets. They actually found ways between the houses, so to speak, so that for about 80%, if not 90% of the journey in from the airport, it's really like a railway and not like what we consider to be a tram. It's not running along streets. It connects with the various railway stations along the same route. And it's only in the last bit, as you come into downtown, that you're kind of behaving like a tram and running along the road. Phase B is, I think, much more about running along roads like we're used to on Spadina in Toronto. And you know, as a result, you know, that whole end of town is now a massive construction site, and so it causes enormous inconvenience, which certainly has caused, you know, unpopularity. But when you get on the thing,
okay, so let's talk about that inconvenience, because that's the you know, we're obviously, when we thought about this, we talked like the comparison between Hamilton and Edinburgh, and the idea that Hamilton's going to be getting into LRT soon. The people against LRT here in Hamilton and in North America is, you know, the inconvenience that the construction is just going to hold up traffic everywhere. It's going to be impossible to get around. It's just going to cause such disruption to build the thing. Phase one in Edinburgh, now that it's built, what's the reception to it by the population there? Like, is it just like, okay, this is a failed project, tear it up and let's start over? Or is it, has perception changed?
I think now it's there. You know, there's a variety of opinions still. However, you know, bums on seats is what the game's about. And you know, I went in at midday on a Thursday or something like that this year. I mean, I've ridden it before. It was full. It's busy. It's very well used. You know, they have something like 37 sort of units that run on the network, which sounds like a lot, but you know, they're running at, you know, between 50 and 100% capacity. So the system is being used. From my own point of view, I mean, why I'm kind of particularly interested in it is that I used to basically live at the end of the line, at the outskirts of Edinburgh, just beyond Edinburgh Airport. And I can tell you that in my about 4 years that I lived there, I used the bus to get into Edinburgh maybe twice, and every other time I drove, because the bus was just not a whole lot of fun. The tram is just so fundamentally different. It's just a better experience. It's smoother, it's quieter, it's cleaner. You know, you're not, particularly in these COVID times, you're not sort of feeling quite so cheek by jowl with everybody as you often do on a double-decker bus. And you know, I feel quite honestly like if I still lived where I lived back in 1990, I don't know when it was, 1996, 7, like something like that, I would use that all the time in preference to the car, because it's actually going to be cheaper. Because by the time you've got into Edinburgh and parked, parking is not a cheap business in Edinburgh. So it seems like it's good. I mean, there are still people who will say, you know, I'm still going to drive in. They've just built a massive new multi-story car park in the center of Edinburgh, which seems to somewhat go against the whole principle of the thing, but you know, whatever.
Right.
But you know, I think it's there now. No one's saying dig it up. I think if, you know, and the second phase is going ahead. And again, while people are still rolling their eyebrows about costs and inconvenience and all the rest of it, when that's done, that will be a fundamentally what it is now will be more than doubly kind of effective, and then it will be really a way to get right across the key parts of the city rather than just into the shopping areas.
Now, the one thing that I thought, hang on one second. Okay. The one thing you mentioned in your essay was how densely populated Edinburgh is. And it's kind of like they kind of did the opposite. Like the idea in the 905, it says like Mississauga and Hamilton, is that we'll bring the LRT and it's going to bring business and population to the areas like along the stretch of track that's supposed to serve. Whereas it seems to me like they did the opposite. They already had the density. Like we need a transit system that's going to serve this population. And I find that's an interesting contrast, just in terms of like both two cities start off in different parts, and I feel like they're coming up to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the case that Edinburgh didn't need an LRT, didn't need the tram in the same way that Hamilton does. Edinburgh was already a very successful, financially prosperous city. House prices in Edinburgh are, a one bedroom condo, in effect, the equivalent of a condo, one bedroom, £600,000, which that's a lot of money by any stretch of the imagination. And I just want to know. So, and it was expensive back in the days when I was living there, and it still is. So, to an extent, the economic benefits are smaller. And I think it was the argument was much more about Edinburgh is just not built for cars. It's a nightmare to drive around. And I say that as someone who drove around it a lot and knew the streets kind of like the back of my hand to an extent. It's uphill and down dale and little corners and inconvenient turning spots, and it's a chaotic system that evolved over 1,000 years, as you said. And anything that can get traffic off the roads and clean up the air downtown, which certainly back in the day, Edinburgh's with a much higher use of diesel vehicles in Europe. The center of Edinburgh was a very smelly, diesely place back in the past, and I think there's a real sort of air quality argument apart from anything else about the new system.
I mean, the other thing that you were kind of hinting at was that, you think like in a North American sensibility, when you're approaching that kind of density downtown, and the fact that all these old streets, old roads, they were built long before the idea of the internal combustion engine was even a concept. Everything was always horse-drawn buggy. That's what the city was, the core was built around. And yet, what I find interesting is that the city didn't say, well, okay, we just abandoned that part of the infrastructure, right? Well, we can't, that's the way it is. We just kind of have to keep building out. The newer buildings always have to go on the outside. Whereas you describe it, and my recollection is that it's very much you use what you got and you build the city to accommodate what you have. So you have, greater density, and it's almost like you bring the stuff to the people, like the shops and the grocery stores and the amenities of life, as opposed to how our North American sensibility is just like, oh, well, we've already used that up. Well, let's just build another neighborhood. Let's build another strip mall, another parking lot on that vacant plot of land over there.
And Edinburgh's had some of those things to an extent. There's actually just out past the end of the new, actually on the LRT route is the big mall, which is called the Guile Centre, which is very much an American style mall. But then again, Edinburgh only has one of those and not 10 of those, which a city in North America might have. It never went through that kind of downturn because no one's going to downtown anymore because it's too difficult to get to, and everybody just goes to the mall instead. It's never had that problem, which certainly we know in the history of Burlington is that downtown Burlington used to be a kind of a no-go zone because it was just it was dead because everybody went to where it was easy to park. So it's not done a lot of it's not made those kind of mistakes that we've made here. I mean, and I don't want to say it's like the promised land and everything's perfect. Edinburgh's got all kinds of social problems. If you've seen Train Spotting, you can know just a few.
Oh yeah.
So it's far from perfect. There's some really unpleasant housing estates that were built in the 60s. There's been some sprawl. There's still some sprawl going on. But basically, they do have a green belt, as most cities in the UK do, that has been in place for a long time, that is not questioned and is not being fundamentally undermined. And sure, there are not the population pressures either that we have. The population of Scotland is not going up, or the UK in general is not going up in anything like the same way that the population of Canada or Ontario is. So there's a difference there, but it is notable. And when I go back to Edinburgh, the boundaries are basically the same. The housing estates are basically the same. There's new infrastructure and modernization that's gone on, but there's not like 10 new housing estates on the edge of town that weren't there when I left. Mm-hmm. And like I say, some of that is because there's just less pressure on population growth, but some of that I think is that people, there's no real. I don't recall in all the time I lived in Britain there being a significant call to roll back green belts, for instance. Like, no, that's just the way it is. There's plenty of pressure still from developers to build, make no mistake, but certain things are just off limits.
So taking that, that sounds eerily similar to our current plight in Ontario, where we are in a housing shortage and there's an urgency to build. What can you take away? What would your observations in Scotland? What can we take away from them and bring here to Ontario?
I think taking back to the LRT tram debate, I think the first thing I would say is it's going to be painful. It's going to, in Hamilton, it's going to be a royal pain in the neck when they're building it. It just is. And that's people may tell you it's not going to be. I would say that's probably not true. It's going to be a pain. But there's the greater the pain, the greater the potential gain, I guess. When it's there, it just seems to me, comparing then and now in Edinburgh, it seems just like a fantastic addition to the city, and one that can only get better as the network expands. That seems to be very much the experience from other cities in the UK where tram systems have been brought back as well. I think Manchester is another one, where their network has really grown very fast and without a lot of the controversy that happened in Edinburgh. So it's worth it. Get prepared to an extent for inconvenience, but it will be worth it. And to an extent, there's less. The difference is that so much of downtown Hamilton is not, it's not a major tourist destination as Edinburgh was. There's going to be less inconvenience in all the ways. And the other thing, a city that treasures its past, that treasures its heritage, that values things from the past, it is a beautiful city at the end of the day. Sure, Edinburgh's got an awful lot of history to go on, whereas our cities tend not to. But I think when you look at why people are starting to look at a city like Hamilton and say, I want to live in Hamilton, not Burlington or Mississauga or wherever, it's because Hamilton, for whatever reason, has managed to keep more of its heritage than those places have, or had more to start with, or the kind of North American thing of anything that isn't new, knock it down, its value is gone, I think is very destructive. And again, sure, Edinburgh is basically the missing middle city of Britain in many ways. It's not a huge city, and again, I don't want to say that it doesn't have its problems, that there aren't things that could be better. But this is a city that is low to medium rise at most, but there are no high rises, which has among the highest population density of any city in Europe. And sure, that's evolved over hundreds of years. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't actually happen because of urban planning of any kind whatsoever. But when you see it in action, it makes for one of the most vibrant, walkable, attractive cities, apart from the weather, on the face of the planet.
Well, it sounds like something that a few cities in the 905 could try to aspire to be, at least maybe incorporate a little bit more into their landscape. I'm gonna say that's probably a good note to end off this episode as well. Thanks very much for flying on your own dime to Edinburgh and bringing us this exclusive inside scoop, if you will.
Happy to fly to any cities that people would like me to go to, although not necessarily on my own dime.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll talk to you on Thursday.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.